Welcome to Silent Screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1: The Haunting of the Ghost Ship Mirella. It had been a cold and foggy evening when the Mirella first appeared on the horizon. The ship had been missing for nearly a decade, vanishing without a trace in the middle of the Atlantic. No distress signals, no crew members, and no wreckage ever found. It had become one of the great maritime mysteries. But there it was, drifting silently toward the harbor, just off the coast of a small, forgotten island. The sea was eerily calm as the ship loomed through the mist, its sails torn and weathered, its hull riddled with long-forgotten scars. Elena, a young researcher who had come to the island to study maritime history, had heard the rumors. Whispers of the Mirella's return had spread like wildfire among the locals. But she hadn't expected to witness it herself. Her colleagues dismissed the stories as superstition. But Elena's curiosity gnawed at her. There was no logical explanation for the ship's sudden reappearance. Yet, despite the unsettling silence that surrounded it, something about the Mirella felt oddly alive. It was the ship's crew, or, more accurately, what remained of it, that caught Elena's attention first. As she stood on the docks, gazing at the silent behemoth, she could see figures moving on deck. Not living people. No, but shadowy, twisted shapes that seemed to fade in and out of existence, as if the ship itself were trying to keep them hidden. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. She had to know more. She had to see what secrets the Mirella held. The islanders were adamant that no one should board the ship. The Mirella carries a curse, they warned, their eyes wide with fear. A curse that has claimed more lives than anyone can count. But Elena was driven. She couldn't resist the pull of the mystery. Armed with nothing but her camera and a notebook, she ventured down to the harbor at dusk. The fog had thickened, cloaking the shore in an unsettling hush, as though the world had been swallowed by the sea. The ship creaked as if greeting her, its ancient timbers groaning under the weight of its long silence. Elena's footsteps echoed in the hollow expanse of the ship's deck as she boarded, her breath shallow, her mind racing. As she explored the Mirella, every corner felt wrong, too dark, too cold, and too still. The air was thick with mildew and rot. But there was also something else. Something more sinister. The faintest whispers seemed to float in the air, just out of reach, their source impossible to pinpoint. Suddenly, she heard footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps, coming from below deck. Her pulse quickened. She had read reports about the crew members, the vanished souls who were said to haunt the ship. But there was no way anyone could still be aboard. Not after all this time. Yet, the sound was unmistakable. Elena descended into the belly of the ship, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. As she rounded a corner, her beam landed on a figure, pale, gaunt, its eyes hollow and vacant. The figure was dressed in tattered sailor's clothes, standing motionless, facing the wall. Elena froze, unable to speak, unable to breathe. And then, with a sharp, unnatural turn of its head, the figure locked eyes with her. Its mouth stretched into a grin. But there was no warmth in it. No humanity. Just darkness. "Leave, while you can," the figure rasped, its voice like the screech of nails on metal. Before she could react, the figure dissolved into mist, disappearing before her very eyes. Elena was shaken, her mind reeling. Was it a hallucination? Or was something truly wrong with the Mirella? She tried to convince herself it was just a trick of the light. But the more she explored, the more the ship seemed to warp around her. Each room she entered felt colder, darker. The air grew thick with a palpable tension, as if unseen eyes were watching her every move. The whispers continued, growing louder, as though they were speaking directly to her. She could make out fragments of words: turn back, don't escape. The further she went, the more the ship seemed to reject her presence. Rooms that once appeared empty now held strange, distorted shapes that melted into the walls when she turned her back. The wooden floors creaked beneath invisible footsteps. Elena felt as though the ship itself was alive, conscious, and it didn't want her there. As the hours passed, Elena discovered that the Mirella had been a research vessel, its crew having conducted experiments on the supernatural long before it had disappeared. Scattered papers in a forgotten cabin revealed notes about strange phenomena encountered during the ship's final voyage, descriptions of ghostly apparitions, violent storms that came out of nowhere, and a crew that slowly descended into madness. But the most chilling discovery was in the captain's quarters. There, in the middle of the room, was a large mirror, its glass cracked and warped. As Elena stood before it, she could see herself, but not as she truly was. The reflection showed her eyes darkened with fear, her face gaunt and pale, as though the ship had drained the life from her. And behind her, there was something else, shadowy figures standing just beyond the reflection, their features blurred and indistinct. One of them reached out a hand, its fingers skeletal and long. Before she could scream, the reflection shifted, and Elena found herself facing the figures directly. They were in the room with her. Their empty, hollow eyes stared into her soul. She turned to flee, but the door slammed shut, trapping her inside the cursed cabin. As the night wore on, Elena's mind began to fracture. The ship seemed to warp around her, time losing all meaning. It was as though the Mirella existed in a place between worlds, and once you stepped aboard, you could never leave. The shadows grew thicker, more oppressive. The whispers turned to screams, the voices of the dead, each one begging her to understand their fate. "We were lost," they wailed. "We are still here." With one last surge of adrenaline, Elena ran toward the deck. But when she reached the top, the harbor was gone. In its place was only endless ocean, stretching out into the abyss. The Mirella was not simply a ghost ship, it was a prison. A place where the souls of the lost were trapped, doomed to sail the seas for eternity. And Elena was now one of them. As the ship sailed further into the fog, Elena's screams were lost to the wind, and the Mirella vanished into the horizon, awaiting its next victim. Story 2: The Phantom of the Endless Sea. It was the summer of 1993 when the crew of the Neptune's Fury disappeared without a trace. The ship was a modest cargo vessel, just big enough to carry goods between coastal ports. Yet its fate would soon become one of the greatest maritime mysteries to haunt the oceans. For years, rumors swirled about the ship's last voyage. The crew, a group of seasoned sailors, had set out from the port of Southampton on a routine mission to deliver supplies to the distant islands of the South Pacific. It was supposed to be a quick and simple job, but it would never be completed. Weeks passed without word from the Neptune's Fury. The last transmission was a garbled distress call, which mentioned nothing but static and a single, unsettling word: lost. When a rescue team was dispatched to investigate, they found the ship adrift in open water, Its sails tattered and its hull eerily still. But there was no sign of life on board. The mystery of the vanished crew was quickly overshadowed by the rumors that began to circulate in hushed whispers in the maritime community. Fishermen and sailors alike spoke of a ghost ship. One that was cursed to sail the seas forever, carrying the souls of the lost crew. No one ever saw the crew of the Neptune's Fury again. And yet, some claim the ship still sails, appearing out of nowhere on dark, fog-laden nights. A silhouette of dread on the horizon. I was just a deckhand aboard the Isabel, a small but capable freighter that made the same route from Southampton to the Caribbean. My first trip had been uneventful, mostly mundane with the usual waves and wind. Until one night when something I still cannot explain, shifted the very fabric of reality around us. It was just past midnight, and the sea was unusually calm. The moon hung in the sky like a sickly eye, casting its glow over the dark water. I stood at the bow, staring out at the emptiness. When I saw it, at first, I thought it was just the mist playing tricks. But no, it was too clear, a dark shape. Its outline too distinct against the backdrop of the night. A ship. But not just any ship. It was the Neptune's Fury. My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the spectral figure emerging from the fog. There it was. Just as the stories described it, tattered sails, a wooden hull weathered by time, and the faintest glow emanating from its portholes. But it wasn't moving. It was just there. And it was heading straight for us. I turned to the others, but no one else seemed to notice. They were all asleep, unaware of the vessel that had been lost to time and legend. Without thinking, I ran to the captain's quarters, banging on the door. The captain, an old, seasoned man with gray hair and a permanent scowl, opened it in a huff. "What's wrong?" he grumbled. "Captain, there's a ship, it's the Neptune's Fury. It's right there." I pointed to the horizon. But he just blinked, staring into the darkness where the ship had been moments before. "Go back to your post, kid. You're seeing things." His tone was dismissive, but I could tell he was troubled. There was something in his eyes that made me question my own sanity. I tried to argue, but the ship was gone, vanished without a trace. The next day, the strange encounter still weighed heavily on my mind. The crew went about their duties as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I approached the captain again, I noticed he seemed more distant, more agitated than usual. "Captain, have you heard the stories about the Neptune's Fury?" I asked cautiously. He glanced at me, his expression hardening. "Don't mention that name on this ship. It's bad luck. The crew that went missing, they weren't the first." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean? What happened to the others?" The captain hesitated, looking out at the horizon, his voice lowering to a near whisper. "They say it's cursed. That ship. Once it takes a crew, they disappear. And the ship keeps sailing. It's like it's feeding on them. And those who see it, those who know too much, are never seen again." I felt a chill run through me as his words sank in. "So, you're saying the crew is still out there? Somewhere," he muttered, "drifting in the fog. You don't want to know more." But it was too late. I needed to know. And as the days passed, strange things began to happen on our ship. The first occurred late one night when I was alone in the galley. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. But when I turned around, No one was there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I heard the creak of the floorboards above me. Though the rest of the crew was supposed to be asleep. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just the stress of the long voyage, but then the sighting started. The shadow of a figure standing at the edge of the deck. The flicker of lights in the distance. And the occasional cold gust of wind that would rush through the ship. Even on calm nights. But the worst was yet to come. One fateful night. The fog rolled in thick. Almost suffocating. As if the sea itself was closing in on us. The ship's creaks and groans became louder. More pronounced. As though it were alive. And then, through the mist, we saw it. The Neptune's fury. It appeared as if summoned by the sea itself. Its silhouette glowing faintly in the eerie mist. But this time, there was something different. It wasn't just a ghostly ship. There were figures aboard. Shadows moving in the windows. And faint whispers carried on the wind. "We have to get away," the captain shouted. His face was pale. His hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. But it was too late. The ghost ship seemed to move of its own accord. Closing the gap between us with an unnatural speed. As it neared, I could see it clearly. The crew, or what remained of them, were visible on the deck, pale. Ghostly figures. Their eyes hollow and empty. Some seemed to reach out toward us. While others stood frozen. Staring into the void. One by one. The crew of the Isabel began to disappear. First, the cook. Then the first mate. Each vanishing without a sound. It was as if they were being pulled toward the Neptune's fury. Their bodies becoming part of its cursed crew. I ran. Panic setting in. And locked myself in the engine room. I don't know how long I stayed there. Listening to the sounds of footsteps and voices that weren't my own. But when I finally emerged, the ship was gone. The fog had lifted. And in the distance, I could see nothing but empty ocean. I was the only one left. The Isabel drifted aimlessly. No longer under the control of any living soul. The crew was gone. And the captain had disappeared without a trace. But I know what happened. I saw it. I felt it. The ship was not just haunted, it was alive. It is said that once you see the Neptune's fury, it will return for you, pulling you into its eternal voyage. The souls of the lost crew are trapped there, cursed to sail forever in search of new victims. And now, I am one of them. The Neptune's fury is out there, still waiting. It's only a matter of time before it comes for me. And when it does, I'll be part of its crew. Just like the others before me. I'm not sure how long I can hold on before I too succumb to the curse of the endless sea. But I won't be alone. There are others out there, like me, lost to the fog. And when the ship comes, I'll join them. And so will you. Story 3, The Ghost Ship of the Forgotten Sea. The night was unnaturally quiet as the small fishing vessel, the Pelican's Grace, drifted far beyond the familiar waters of the coastal islands. A storm had passed through earlier, leaving only the faintest ripple on the surface of the ocean. The crew, a seasoned group of men and women, knew better than to stray too far out into these treacherous waters. But the allure of a forgotten shipwreck, rumored to hold treasures long lost to the sea, was too tempting to resist. Captain Nolan Pierce stood at the helm, his weathered face a mask of determination. Steady. Now, he muttered, more to himself than to his crew. The wind will change soon enough. Below deck, the rest of the crew prepared for the dive. They'd heard whispers from other fishermen about the Solace. A ghost ship that had vanished decades ago, taking with it the crew's souls. But stories were just stories. What they didn't know, however, was that the Solace was not just a ship, it was a curse. A ship of the damned. And the ocean had been waiting for them. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the Pelican's Grace approached a stretch of water few had ever ventured into. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the faintest scent of something ancient. Something forgotten. "Captain, we're nearing the coordinates," shouted First Mate Olivia Carter from the crow's nest. Her voice was sharp, betraying a hint of unease. Nolan nodded. "Prepare the diving gear. We're going in." The sea had grown eerily still as the ship anchored in the designated spot. The crew gathered on deck, all of them aware of the uneasy silence that seemed to hang in the air. The water was unnaturally dark, like ink pooling in a vast ocean. It felt wrong, as if the depths themselves were waiting. "We'll go down in teams of 2. Nolan ordered. "Keep your radios on at all times. If anything feels off, get out." The first team, Olivia and Jonah, descended into the depths. The water was colder than they had anticipated, and the closer they got to the ocean floor, the thicker the darkness seemed to become. Jonah's light flickered, and Olivia could swear she saw something moving in the shadows. "You see that?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Jonah shook his head, but there was an edge to his disbelief. "Nothing down here. You're imagining it." They reached the wreckage. The Solace, as it had been described in the stories. The ship's hull was twisted and broken, a massive skeleton jutting out from the depths. The eeriness of it all sent a chill down Olivia's spine. She could feel eyes on her, eyes that shouldn't have been there. And then, the sound, whispers. Faint but unmistakable, like voices carried by the wind. They seemed to come from the ship itself. "Jonah, do you hear that?" Olivia asked, her heart hammering. Jonah froze, his face paling. "It's not the wind." Suddenly, a shadow moved beneath them, far too large to be any fish. Olivia felt the water around her grow colder, and the whispers became louder, more distinct. They weren't alone. When Olivia and Jonah resurfaced, their faces were ashen, their eyes wide with terror. The others scrambled to help them aboard, their questions falling on deaf ears. "Did you find it?" Nolan asked, his voice steady but his eyes flicking nervously from Olivia to Jonah. "Not just the wreck." Olivia gasped, her words trembling. "There's something down there, something that shouldn't be. The Solace isn't just a ship, it's a prison. A cursed one." Jonah nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "We weren't alone. Something was watching us from the depths." The crew fell silent. None of them had expected this. They had heard the rumors, of course, but nobody had taken them seriously. Now, the fear was palpable. As they tried to pull away from the wreck, the water around them seemed to shift, the currents pulling them back toward the ship. "What's happening?" Olivia screamed, clutching the side of the boat as the waves grew violent. Nolan tried to steer, but it was no use. The ship was moving against its will, trapped by an unseen force. And then, as if emerging from the very ocean itself, the Solace appeared once again. It wasn't a ghost ship, not entirely. It was as if the ship had never truly sunk. existing between the world of the living and the dead. Its rotting timbers creaked as it floated beside them, its sails torn and tattered, its once proud masts now twisted and broken. The faint sound of music, a soft, mournful tune, carried over the water. "They're here," Jonah muttered, his voice hollow with fear. "The souls of the damned." Suddenly, the ship lurched, and the crew found themselves pulled toward the wreckage, their boat dragged along by an invisible force. As they were drawn closer, they saw figures moving on the deck of the Solace, figures that looked human. But their eyes were hollow, their movements unnatural. They were trapped. A thick mist rolled in, obscuring their vision. The ship was now eerily still, its presence suffocating. Olivia and Jonah could hear the whispers again, clearer now. And this time they weren't just voices. They were calls. Desperate pleas. Cries for help from those who had never left the ship. One by one, the crew members began to vanish. First, it was Malcolm, the youngest of the crew, who had gone below deck to check the ship's hold. His scream echoed across the water before it was abruptly cut off. Next, it was Jonah. He had gone overboard, drawn by the siren call of the ship's cursed music. No one saw him go. But when Olivia searched the water, all she found was his radio, floating on the surface, static filling the airwaves. Nolan was next, his body found lifeless at the helm, his eyes wide in terror, his lips frozen in a silent scream. The Solace had claimed him. Olivia, now the only one left, clung to the deck of the Pelican's Grace, her hands shaking, her breath coming in frantic gasps. She knew what had to be done. There was no escaping the curse. The ship was feeding on their fear, on their desperation. But there was one last thing, one last horrifying secret that she had uncovered in the depths. The Solace was not just a ship of the dead. It was a vessel of torment, bound to drag the souls of the living into its endless abyss. And Olivia was next. As the mist closed in around her, Olivia's world grew smaller, more suffocating. The whispers were now deafening, voices calling her name, urging her to join them. She stood at the edge of the deck, staring at the ship that was now looming over her. Its towering, decaying masts stretching like skeletal fingers. She could see the faces of the lost crew, pale, hollow-eyed, their mouths moving, but no sound coming out. Then, she saw him, Jonah, his face twisted in agony, his eyes pleading for release. His ghostly figure reached out to her, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Join us, Olivia. We can't escape, none of us can." Tears streamed down Olivia's face as she turned away from the Solace and looked toward the dark waters. There was no escape from the curse, no escaping the ship. She knew that now. As she took her first step toward the edge, the sea rose up to meet her. The Pelican's Grace was found days later, drifting aimlessly on the surface, its crew nowhere to be found. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just an empty vessel, drifting in the vast ocean. And in the distance, the faintest glimmer of a ship on the horizon, its sails torn and tattered, as it sailed toward the forgotten sea once more.